Okay, it works. Thank you. I saw already in the Slido system a question concerning the way how we recently trying to renovate ethical reviews in the sense of, do we need to stay more with this local, regional approach because we need to reflect the culture, the different perspectives in the different member states and regions, or is it more independent to centralize systems? So what is your view on this movement? I mean, we move to a more compromised system, and that means also more centralization from different perspectives. But what does that mean for an ethics review? What is your perspective on that, from a practical point of view and also from the regulator's point of view?
Thank you, Dirk. I wasn't quite sure it was going to be directed to me, but it is now, obviously. Thank you. Yeah, it's a tricky one because I still believe that there's an enormous value in having local input, partly because the people, it depends what's being reviewed. I mean, there may be a separate scientific element which probably should be generic and doesn't need an individual review from every institution, but there are an awful lot of things that are not just about, you know, the number of clinical trials that institution has done, but it's also ethos and values, very much as Laura was saying. There are clearly some institutions in this country who have withdrawn, not got involved in particular research ethical studies because of the particular religious values held by the institution. I think we have to reflect that and accept that. There's no point in trying to challenge that because that institution isn't necessarily going to change everything for that particular trial, but there is a broader issue with it. So I think there are still very much elements to it. I noticed there's a slide that came through which probably relates to that, which is the kind of the club atmosphere that sometimes can happen when researchers are on both sides. They're sitting on the clinical trials, they're not on the review ethics committee, but actually they've also submitted to it as well. And there obviously committees will have people standing back and stepping out. And there is a danger of being somewhat too cosy in relation to local ethics committees. I think that does need a frank discussion beforehand for anybody entering into those committees, and that doesn't always happen. Partly because research ethics committees are often struggling to find people to join their committee, and if you set more hurdles for them, it becomes more difficult then to try and get a research ethics committee. But I think it's a really important point to deal with. I mean, I suppose one could argue that the CTR is essentially made for clinical trials, at least remove the whole local exercise. Whether some local research ethics committee then feel devalued by doing that, and it's certainly an issue, and that you may get the kind of the small minor issues which aren't the big pictures which formerly that research ethics could have done. But I still think that there's enormous value for that, and there's an awful lot of research that I think we don't know about, which is actually clinical research, which is not clinical trials but it's multi-centre, that is actually really good and needs a lot of support from research ethics committees.
So this is one of those questions which is tiger country for me, because as a European regulator in a central body and with the clinical trials regulation respecting national autonomy, particularly in the ethics assessment, that a very wise man would probably stop there. But maybe I'll be a little bit unwise. I think the history of ethics bodies has been very, very local, generally. I mean, I know that's an oversimplification. And that, I think, is great. And as you say, it brings value, particularly when you've got a small clinical trial. Therefore, knowing the values of the in that context, knowing the pedigree, perhaps, of the research group and so on, is probably very helpful. However, you see the monkeypox story, and you see that actually when you have to have lots and lots and lots of different bodies making a judgment based on more or less the same dossier and probably the same ethical questions, it can lead to a lot of delay, and that delay can actually be very negatively impactful, if you like. So I guess the answer is nuanced. Under the clinical trials regulation, I would hope, and through the projects that I referred to, like CTR Collaborate and this new EU-level ethics body, we can smooth out some of the administrative complexities so that things can be faster and more efficient. But I would say that should not be at the expense of a rich local foundation for ethics advice.
When we look at the perspective, what is needed in an ethical review, and can we harmonize the procedures and the ideas? There are recommendations like from SciOms, like from ICH, etc. Deirdre, what do you think? Do we need to introduce them more in the communities of researchers and research ethics committees members to be more acquainted with those harmonization processes in ethical principles, in procedures, etc.? Would that help to harmonize the European process? This is one request here. Do we need more training, more interaction like today? What is your view on that? Because you see the history of it.
I mean, I think obviously any opportunities for education and training and networking and learning from each other, I think, is always a positive. And I think, but I think those opportunities must also include the PPI aspect that we mentioned, and some of the other speakers have spoken about as well. I think we, as researchers, as academics, as scientists, we also learn from interaction with and partnership with the patients. Yeah. And I think that that's a really fundamental aspect of all of this, because of the aspects of trust that have been mentioned as well by some of the speakers. We can't build trust and maintain trust and keep research alive and being promoted and supported without engaging with all of that aspect. So the training and education is really important, and harmonization of standards and harmonization of values, but I think it has to be very much inclusive, and I know that's part of the next session as well, so I think that's really important.
Andrew?
Just one point, and again it's related to local issues. In some institutions there isn't necessarily a research and audit office within that particular institution that can help researchers design projects, and then by default the research ethics committee becomes everything in terms of how to determine what research is and what should come to them, trying to also help research design, statistical recruitment, all that, which strictly is not the role of a research ethics committee, but if the research doesn't get done, it needs that support and input. So it's kind of a pragmatic way that some research committees get sucked into things that are actually out with their normal experience. And that, again, often it's improving, because many more institutions in this country will now have formal research offices, research and innovation offices, as universities have had for years, but a lot of research in healthcare institutions haven't had that. And that should help a difference, which means that the research ethics can focus on what should be their role. And again, a lot of those research offices should also be forcing engagement with PPI patients and the study before it ever gets to ethics, rather than doing it the other way around.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Oh,
you get a mic.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just let him know. Yeah, just touching on the subject of PPI. My name is Joan Jordan. I participated in a clinical trial for a multiple sclerosis drug about 10 years ago. So I have actually been on a trial. And I'm also a EUPATI fellow, that's the European Patients Academy. And the question that I would like to ask, I did ask a question on Slido, but I didn't have enough characters. The question that I would like to ask is that, do you think the Irish public understand what ethics is? Now, Emily this morning gave a really good, she said that ethics is the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. So, do you think that the public in general understand what ethics is? Because I think there's so much fake news and information out there on the internet. And there's one example that I have, it's the UNCRPD, which is going through a very public campaign at the moment. It's all over the radio, it's all over the TV. There's an ad in Irish about it. And I think initially with the UNCRPD, people said, well, some people said that the public wouldn't understand what it meant, what the UNCRPD meant. But I really think that if you do give people the opportunity, and you can break down ethics as simply as what Emily said this morning, that people will be much more aware, that there'll be more trust, that the PPI aspect is great, but I think it's a very small sample of the population that get to have their voice heard. So do you think that, how do you think that the public in general can become more informed about ethics, research, become more informed about, even because I must say myself, when I did my clinical trial, I did sign the informed consent, and my patient information leaflet was only 25 pages long, so I got a short version. But you know, it's still at the time, it just didn't really, until I did the EUPATI course, it didn't really. There was just so much information there that I felt quite overwhelmed, and any time I did have a question, I felt that I didn't really have the confidence or to stand up for myself. Yeah. So I just wanted to know about how you feel about education public in general about ethics.
Yeah. Andrew?
Again, this is slightly local. Ireland is one of the last European countries to actually sign up to the UN Rights to Disabilities. And there's a competition. But actually, and I know the advertisements you talked about, there's an enormous ethical concept in there which isn't actually stated, which is equity and justice for people with disabilities. But it's not explicit. It's assumed in saying that those are the values that we should be representing for the people, the many of us who are disabled in whatever ways we have it, and accepting those as people who deserve justice and equity. It's not explicitly said that. Whether you can take a different approach and starting from talking about ethics from top down in a kind of a slightly ivory tower approach, it's probably much more difficult. But the practical application of it is probably more something the public will get a lot more than a theoretical discussion. And I mean, because if you go to universities and talk to philosophers, sorry, I'm now treading on your toes, Dirk, a lot of them will turn around and say, well, I'm a philosopher, but I'm not an ethicist. Because there is a big split between that.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, I would agree with you about the need for more public education and dissemination of information. I mean, Andrew, you mentioned the Irish Council for Bioethics, publications of documents and guidance and consultation papers, discussion forums, you know, working groups, focus groups, all of these things, I think, to help have debates around issues, not only in terms of research ethics, but obviously ethics in all sorts of healthcare. And I think, I don't think we're great at that in this country. I think we could do an awful lot more of that. I think we should have more debates on our national media involving ethical issues than we do. I think a lot of the national media is consumed by negative stories about healthcare, and I think we could do a lot more in terms of educating and engaging the public on the ethical values that underpin a lot of the way in which we deliver healthcare. So I would certainly like to see a lot more of that.
I see this also as a very important point, because I think that the style of research changed in the last years. Society became much more involved in research, in Part 4 studies, in studies with medical devices. Very often research within the society, and therefore I think this interaction between society and research need to be much stronger. And when we discussed the first draft of the EU regulation 2012, 2013, I talked a lot with journalists, and many of them were not aware about research ethics, about what research ethics committees or bodies are doing. You deal with euthanasia and genetics and ethics and things like that. No, they were not aware about what is the process, and they didn't even know how a research protocol, clinical research trial works. So not only the ethics, also the whole procedure. So, and therefore, I think this interaction becomes more and more important. Also, the researchers ask now for more data from treatments, from patients, for research, and they ask for more public spirit from the community, and therefore it's so important. But we should also ask the researchers, and in particular the companies, the sponsors, to share the benefit of the products when we share the data and also taxpayers' money for that. Laura, please.
Dirk, thank you. I think we have two choices on how to really get research ethics into the public's mind. So choice number one, and there's a conflict of interest here, but we just need another pandemic. The COVID pandemic did more for awareness of medical research and all of its different facets than most things over the last 100 years. Option two, we integrate research into clinical care. There are so many decisions that doctors make every day for which there is no strong evidence base. So if we admit to patients that we don't know everything, and we randomize more frequently, and we make our healthcare system a learning healthcare system where we are doing research all of the time, and then we have the opportunity to talk to patients about every aspect of research, including the ethics. You can take your pick of those two.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Please, yeah. Please wait for the mic.
Don't mind.
Sorry.
I've been holding this mic since the start of your, because I am absolutely dying to talk to Peter about my next question. So I was hiding over in this corner chair, so I don't think you saw me. So I'm Evelyn Mulroe from Cancer Trials Ireland. I've been working in Cancer Trials Ireland for about 8.5 years. And Peter's slide about academic-led clinical trials in Europe, I think we're one of the outliers because we actually sponsor a lot of clinical trials across member states in Europe as a little Irish academic clinical trials group. And we do that because we're enabled to do that. 20% of our funding comes from the Health Research Board and 30% comes from the Irish Cancer Society. And the other half comes from other collaborative groups across the world, whether it's the University of Cologne or ANZ up in Australia, that fund us to run trials right across the board in cancer trials. And I think, you know, for academic research, my ethical question is, what is the ethics of treating academic-led trials in exactly the same way as we treat commercial-led trials? Because it is really, really tough as an academic-led clinical trials group to operate at the level. Now, we have 50 people working in Cancer Trials Ireland. We've done very, very well and been very successful in bringing pivotal treatments to patients, both innovative immunotherapies right across to surgical trials. But the questions we ask are led by the patient need in the clinic. They're not led by the dollar. They're not led by commercial intent. And I think that's quite ethical in its sense, because, you know, when we ran a trial with esophageal cancer with Professor John Reynolds across Europe in sites in Denmark and the UK, and the question was around radiotherapy and chemotherapy and surgery. There isn't a pharmaceutical company in the world that was going to run that trial, but we did because the question was important. And we did have to operate through the regulator, the HPRA, who I will say are very supportive. EUREC are very supportive, have always had an open door. We're very blessed with our spirit and culture of collaboration in Ireland. But in Europe, Peter, what are we going to do to help academic-led trials? And what are we going to do to help academic-led organisations in Europe to work with the States and to work with others? We've got great relationships with Australia. It's really, really tough to run academic-led trials from the US in Europe. And we do that, but it's become tougher. So that's why I was really hoping to get a chance to make that point, because it's really important.
Thank you so much.
So first point, I think we're on the same team. We're on the no, seriously, because sometimes as a regulator you get into a bit of a them and us. And what I was hoping to convey as a key message is we're trying to make the clinical research environment better, and we recognise that there's a profoundly important role for academic-led clinical trials. My point was, there's a great opportunity to make things better because a lot of the academic clinical trials aren't the big clinical trials that you're referring to. Interestingly, and I don't want to pre-announce because it's not yet all settled, but there will be a suite of support tools coming out next year. Some of it may be about funding, some of it may be about regulatory help desk type things, and so on. But we're not quite there to announce it yet. What's interesting, just a couple of little anecdotes. Firstly, you know, currently the GCP guidelines are going through revision at ICH. only in the last couple of days I've received emails from the people involved in that redrafting about finding the right wording on their applicability to academic rather than commercial clinical trials, because the issue that you're reflecting on, should it just be a totally same rules on both sides, it comes up all the time, and it's not specific to your view. It's widely understood. So I just wanted to say it's a live debate. So maybe I leave it there. We're on the same team, I would conclude.
Thank you, Pedro. Please.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for an excellent session. I'm Professor Varma, physician, cardiologist, have been involved in many clinical trials, and a current REC member. My question specifically is to Pedro. The role of big pharma and government, particularly with EMA, do they influence you in any way? Do they bring pressure on you in any way? Because big pharma have got a lot of vested interest in medicines that we as physicians prescribe to patients. Would you like to comment on that, please?
What a wonderful, neutral, easy to answer question. So, I have high confidence that our assessments that adopted by the committees at the European Medicines Agencies are independent of direct influence from the pharmaceutical industry. They are, however, based on submissions from the pharmaceutical industry. So if that's an influence, they're submitting the dossier, we are then assessing and judging that dossier. But in terms of our committee members, the expert advice we get, our governance structure, we have, I think, a spectacularly well thought out conflicts of interest policy, which is very vigorously applied. So I'm confident, and I can, we are not influenced by the industry, I think, in the way that your question was intended. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Ruben Keane. I work for the National Clinical Trials Office here and also for Trinity College as sponsor. I suppose just maybe asking for a comment from Irish perspective, but maybe also from German perspective, etc., on how we can free up our clinicians to be on the RECs, because despite the wonderful work of Anna Therese and the REC Reform Committee, we now have a situation where we have a moratorium on hiring in our health services executive, which means they can't take on any staff to replace staff who leave, etc. And we also have no protected time for our clinicians to voluntarily be on these committees. So I'm always amazed that people do it. So how do they manage in other countries, and could we learn from other countries around how this could be done, perhaps?
Is it me? Yeah. We have in Germany regular meetings with the authorities. We have a consultation group with pharmaceutical industry and industry from medical devices, the competent authority, and patient groups. So what we're trying to do is that we have a kind of governance, ethics governance, systematic governance to get these groups together. Yeah? And that means to get several types of inputs. So we have 2 national meetings a year, and before the meeting starts, we have these consultation groups, that's how we call it, to meet. And then we try to figure out what is on the table, what do we need to perform and to clarify. For example, recently we have the political issue that the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany would like to establish a central ethics committees for clinical trials. So, and now we're trying to figure out what is the background, what is the mood in the different groups, and what is bad in the recent system. Yeah? So we try to have this type of dialogue between the different groups. And I think it works in our country quite well. In our country, the RECs are very independent from the competent authorities and from the Ministry of Health. So they are stated with the chambers of physicians and with the medical faculties. So they don't have this very strong relation to the regulators as in other countries or to the ministries. So I think this is very important to see these very different structures in the countries. But I
So it's a difficult issue. In some countries, it isn't quite in the new consultant medical contract here, is that one can have protected time for specific activities, academic activities that mightn't necessarily be the core business of the clinical service you're doing. And those could be allocated in a number of ways. It may be bench research, but it could also be other issues like rec involvement. It could also be some whatever advocacy groups as well. And they would be recognised time which is built into a contract. That's not in the current contract. So currently, those are actually more likely to be people who have academic part-time contracts, which are actually very difficult to get. It's a huge problem here. And again, most of the clinicians, including me, do a lot of this out of the time that you don't have. And it's not an easy solution problem. It goes back to a recent contract, yeah.
Time we don't have. This is what the case is right now. So we have to finish this session in time, nearly in time. So thank you again for all your talks. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you, all of you.